between the two endpoints or two edges or two databases. Okay, so that connection we can establish with the help of task. So task means it always establishing a connection between a source and target. Establishing a connection between source and target, and it will act as a bridge between the source and target. It acts as a bridge between the task, acting as a source and target. Now, how this connection will establish? How the connection will be established here? If you want to establish a connection between source and target, if you want to establish a connection between source and target, what details are required? How can we establish a connection between source and target or between two databases? We will see. Okay. The very first thing is, if you want to create a replicate task, you should be able to create endpoint connection. Endpoint connection. Okay. Endpoint connection is required. So what is meant by endpoint connection? What are all the details required to create endpoint connection? How many different types of endpoint connections are there? Okay. So first one, what is meant by endpoint connection? A endpoint connection consists of all the source or target server details, database details, port details, username, and password. Endpoint connection is using to establish a connection between a replicate to either source database or target database. Endpoint connection endpoint connection is a connector between replicate and source or target. Endpoint connection is a connector between replicate and source or target. So, first you should be able to establish connection between a source and replicate and target. See the connectivity, how it will be. Source to replicate, replicate to target. You should be able to establish connection between source to replicate, replicate to target. Here we have two different types of endpoint connections. Two types of endpoint connections. Number one, source endpoint connection. Target endpoint connection. So what this endpoint connection will do? The endpoint connection will establish a connection between a replicate and the database. The endpoint connection establish a connection between replicate and database. Okay. Endpoint connection establish a connection between a replicate and database. Endpoint connection is a connector between replicate to source, replicate to target, or source to replicate. It acts as a bridge between the source to replicate. Here is just try to understand the entire replicate acting as a bridge between source and target. If you see this one, the entire replicate acting as a bridge between source and target. If you see here one more, so this is your replicate. This is your replicate. This is your replicate. Here, this is your source endpoint. Target endpoint. Okay. How it will work, this is your source. Okay. This is your target. From here to source endpoint connection will be like this. Okay. The target endpoint connection again same. Okay. So what it is doing, this is our overall replicate. Okay. So this is your replicate. Inside this replicate, if you see here, source endpoint connection connecting to the source, target point endpoint connection to the target. So in between, what replicate will do? Replicate will establish connection between these two. Again, see the difference. Okay. If you see here, okay. If you see here, inside replicate, again, we are having endpoint connections. Source endpoint connection, target endpoint connection. Okay. Source endpoint connection establishing connection to the source. Target endpoint connection establishing connection to the target. Okay. So these endpoint connections acting as a bridge between source and target. And finally,